There is a certain conversation that never quite arrives at the surface. You've likely been in it more times than you can count, though perhaps you wouldn't call it a conversation at all. It's an exchange made of gestures, subtle pauses, half glances, and unspoken threads that seem, to you, louder than words could ever hope to be. Yet, somehow, the world rarely seems to notice these conversations taking place. If you are an INFJ or an INTJ, you know this intimately. You know what it is to speak in symbols, not because you choose to be cryptic, but because words are so often too small to carry what you are trying to say. You know the ache of expressing something vital, only to feel that what reached the other person was a mere shadow of your intent, a diluted echo of what you had woven internally. And so, you learn to speak in symbols, not as a flourish or aesthetic, but as a necessity. Symbols that compress depth into simplicity, that gesture toward meanings which cannot be fully explained, only felt. But what happens when the symbols are not recognized? When the other person is reading your sentences, but never sees the layered subtext you believe to be obvious? Carl Jung once wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But for INFJs and INTJs, this transformation often remains suspended because what they are offering is not always received. They reach out with symbolic frameworks, with intuitive scaffolding, hoping the other person will step into that space and meet them there. And when it doesn't happen, the silence that follows is not empty, it is deafening. If you've ever felt misunderstood, not because you lacked clarity, but because you were speaking in a language others couldn't hear, then this is for you. Today, we are going to explore that language, the symbolic way INFJs and INTJs communicate, and why it often feels like no one is listening. We often think of communication as the exchange of words, a linear transmission of thought, packaged in sentences, delivered with the expectation that the other person will simply open the box and receive its contents as intended. But for INFJs and INTJs, this process has always felt inadequate, as if the words themselves are merely fragile vessels, incapable of holding the complexity of what needs to be conveyed. You might recall moments when you said something seemingly ordinary, yet behind those words was a labyrinth of layered meaning, associations, memories, emotional undercurrents, all silently woven into a simple phrase. You weren't speaking for the surface response. You were speaking to invite the other person into that labyrinth, hoping they would follow the thread. But more often than not, they didn't. Have you ever felt this dissonance? Have you ever watched someone respond to the literal shell of what you said, oblivious to the symbolic architecture you had built beneath it? Not because they were unkind or disinterested, but because they were simply not tuned to the frequency you were transmitting on. For the INFJ, this dissonance is an emotional one. Dominant introverted intuition, NI, perceives patterns and emotional atmospheres that most people never consciously register, while auxiliary extroverted feeling, FE, seeks to harmonize these perceptions into relational dynamics. An INFJ's words are often charged with emotional subtext, subtle invitations for empathy and attunement. Yet when those invitations are met with blank, literal interpretations, the INFJ feels not just misunderstood, but unseen. For the INTJ, the dissonance is systemic. NI perceives underlying structures and future trajectories, while extroverted thinking, TE, strives to implement these insights into actionable strategies. An INTJ's brief observation about a flawed system is rarely just a critique. It is the visible tip of an entire mental model they've constructed, a compressed blueprint they expect others to intuitively expand. When responses stay tethered to the surface problem without recognizing the larger vision, the INTJ feels isolated, as if their systemic language is being flattened into a checklist. Carl Jung remarked, "Man needs difficulties, they are necessary for health." But what of the difficulty of being perpetually unheard, not in volume, but in depth? For INFJs and INTJs, speaking in symbols is not an affectation. It is a cognitive necessity, a way of distilling immense inner landscapes into communicable fragments. Yet those fragments, when received without expansion, create a persistent ache, a sense of never quite arriving in the space of mutual understanding. Perhaps you've noticed how exhausting it is to explain what should have been felt. Perhaps you've found yourself withdrawing mid-conversation, not out of arrogance, but because you sense the futility of unpacking layers that the other person does not even see as existing. If you've ever felt like your words were only shadows of what you truly meant, stay with me. The mind of an INFJ or INTJ does not move in straight lines. It spirals inward, compressing vast constellations of thought, emotion, and vision into singular, dense symbols. What may appear on the surface to be a simple statement is in truth a carefully folded map, a compression of layers upon layers of internal processing distilled into the smallest possible vessel. Have you ever found yourself saying something that seemed to you to carry a world of meaning, only to watch it pass unnoticed, as if it had no weight at all? Have you felt the quiet frustration of realizing that what you offered was not received in its intended form, but reduced, flattened, lost in translation? This compression of meaning is not a choice. It is the cognitive architecture of Ni-dominant types. Introverted intuition, Ni, is a synthesizer, a weaver of disparate threads into unified patterns. For INFJs, this synthesis often blends emotional nuance with conceptual insight, resulting in expressions that are emotionally saturated yet outwardly subtle. For INTJs, the synthesis is strategic, building complex systems and models that, when spoken, are delivered in brief, declarative strokes, expecting the listener to unfold the implied blueprint. The auxiliary functions, Fe for INFJs, Te for INTJs, shape how this compressed meaning is externalized. INFJs, through Fe, aim to harmonize with the emotional tone of the conversation, often softening their symbolic expressions into palatable forms, hoping the emotional resonance will be felt, even if the full depth remains unspoken. INTJs, guided by Te, distill their internal systems into efficient, outcome-focused statements, expecting the listener to intuitively extrapolate the broader implications. But herein lies the paradox. The very compression that feels natural to INFJs and INTJs often becomes the barrier to being understood. Because most people are listening for the explicit, the spelled out, the linear narrative. They are not trained to hear the symphonic chord hidden within a single note. Jung observed, "All the works of man have their origin in creative fantasy. What right have we then to depreciate imagination?" For NIDOMs, every act of communication is an act of creative compression, an imaginative folding of vast inner landscapes into symbolic gestures. Yet, when these gestures are met with literal interpretations, the imaginative act feels diminished, as if the symbol was never allowed to unfold. Perhaps you've noticed how exhausting it is to have to explain the depths that, to you, feel self-evident. Perhaps you've caught yourself withdrawing mid-sentence, not because you lost the thread, but because you sensed the listener had no idea there was a thread to follow in the first place. This is not about being overly complex for the sake of it. It is about the cognitive reality of compressing intricate, intuitive patterns into communicable fragments. And when those fragments are received without expansion, the dissonance reverberates, not loudly, but persistently, like a low hum of loneliness beneath the surface of every conversation. Have you ever wondered if you're asking too much of others to expect them to unpack your compressed meaning? Or is it simply that you have not yet found those who speak in symbols too? If this feels like the story of how you've always communicated, consider subscribing. This is a language we're learning to decode together. There is a particular kind of loneliness that does not announce itself with grand gestures of isolation. It is quiet, insidious, and often invisible even to the one who carries it. For INFJs and INTJs, this loneliness is born not from physical solitude, but from the persistent experience of their symbolic language being unheard, unread, unnoticed. Every conversation that bypasses the depth you tried to offer leaves behind a residue. It's subtle, but it accumulates, a quiet sediment of disconnection that settles over time. You might not even notice it at first. You think perhaps it was just a miscommunication. Perhaps you didn't explain yourself well enough. So you try again, you soften your words, you elaborate more, hoping the next attempt will land. But after enough attempts, something within you shifts. Have you ever caught yourself mid-sentence, suddenly aware that the person in front of you is only catching fragments of what you're offering, and wondered if it's worth continuing? Have you ever felt that a conversation became an act of performance, where you are translating your thoughts into a dialect that feels foreign, exhausting, and fundamentally insufficient? For INFJs, this dissonance strikes at the heart of emotional authenticity. Their Fae seeks connection, harmony, shared emotional space. But when their symbolic expressions of feeling are flattened into surface-level exchanges, a kind of emotional detachment sets in, not as a rejection, but as a shield. It becomes safer to withdraw into night-eye loops, rehearsing and refining internal monologues, rather than exposing them to the risk of external dilution. For INTJs, the detachment manifests through intellectual seclusion. Their Te strives for efficient, actionable dialogue. But when the systemic visions they embed within their concise statements are met with surface-level reactions, the INTJ retreats into the cold sanctuary of Te loops, preferring the clarity of their internal models over the noise of misunderstood conversations. Carl Jung warned, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." And for dominant types, what is important is rarely what is obvious. Their language operates in symbols, implications, and patterns that most of the world is not trained to perceive, let alone understand. This is not arrogance. It is not a belief in one's superiority of thought or emotional depth. It is the quiet resignation of realizing that what feels vivid, intricate, and alive within you often dies the moment it reaches the air, suffocated by the limitations of literal language. Have you noticed how, over time, you began to ration your expressions? How you learned to anticipate misunderstanding before you even spoke, editing yourself in real time to minimize the inevitable dissonance? Have you ever wondered how much of your inner world remains unshared, not because you are unwilling, but because you no longer believe it is possible to share it fully? This is the loneliness of symbolic communication. It is not loud. It does not scream. It whispers. And over time, its whispers can become a kind of silence that feels safer than the risk of being unheard. If any of this sounds uncomfortably familiar, don't turn away yet. Yet, amidst the dissonance, there are moments, rare, fleeting, but unforgettable, where the symbolic language lands, a glance, a pause, a single unfinished sentence met with a knowing smile. These are not ordinary conversations. They are resonances, moments when the labyrinth you built internally is mirrored in another, when the symbols you speak are not only understood, but reflected back, expanded, co-created. For INFJs, this resonance often manifests as an emotional mirroring. Someone who senses their emotional subtext without requiring it to be spelled out, who navigates the unspoken tensions with the same intuitive fluidity. It is not about being told, "I understand you," but feeling that understanding expressed in the subtle harmonies of interaction. For INTJs, the resonance is systemic, a collaborator who doesn't just hear their concise critique, but intuitively extrapolates the underlying architecture, who sees the unspoken systems map and begins building upon it. It is a moment of shared vision where ideas no longer need translation, where thought moves in synchrony. These moments are rare, but they are not accidents. They occur when two minds, both attuned to symbolic cognition, encounter each other in the right emotional or intellectual context. They are reminders that symbolic communication is not inherently flawed. It is simply uncommon, and when it is met, it is transformative. Carl Jung's concept of individuation speaks directly to this phenomenon. As individuals integrate their inner complexities, they become capable of perceiving and being perceived on a deeper symbolic level. True communication, then, is not a transactional exchange of information, but a mutual unfolding of consciousness. Perhaps you have felt it in a conversation where silence carried more meaning than words, where gestures became sentences, where the space between phrases was filled with an understanding so palpable it needed no articulation. These are not everyday encounters. They are rare alignments, like two frequencies tuning into the same wavelength, creating a resonance that feels almost sacred. It is not unlike the experience of music, where a single chord, struck at the right moment, reverberates through the body, evoking emotions that no amount of verbal explanation could capture. Or a piece of art that speaks to something within you long before you can articulate why. Symbolic resonance is this, except it is alive, moving between people, creating a shared space where the abstract becomes tangible. These encounters do more than validate, they heal. They remind INFJs and INTJs that their way of perceiving is not a solitary confinement, but a bridge that, though narrow, can be crossed by those who are willing to listen with more than their ears. In a world saturated with noise, these moments of quiet resonance are oxygen. Have you ever experienced a connection where you felt, not just understood, but seen, in the language beneath language, in the symbols you didn't have to explain? How did that moment shape your understanding of what communication could be? It is easy, in the day-to-day friction of miscommunication, to forget that such resonance exists. But when it happens, even once, it redefines what communication can be. It becomes a quiet assurance that somewhere there are those who not only hear your symbols, but respond in kind. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a conversation where words were almost unnecessary? I'd love to hear how that felt for you. But life does not offer the luxury of symbolic resonance in every interaction. The world is not always tuned to the frequencies we wish to speak on, and the people we encounter are not always equipped to decipher the layers we weave into our words. Yet the choice is not binary. It is not a matter of reducing yourself to surface-level exchanges or remaining perpetually unseen. There is a third path, the art of translation without betrayal. Translation, in this context, is not about simplifying complexity. It is about choosing which layers to reveal and which to allow to remain as quiet undercurrents. It is the conscious act of guiding others into your symbolic space, offering them a map, not to the entire labyrinth, but to the doorway. For INFJs, this means resisting the fey impulse to over-accommodate, the tendency to preemptively soften, dilute, or reshape their expressions in pursuit of harmony can become an act of self-erasure. Instead, the task is to hold space for their emotional truths, to express their layered meanings without surrendering them at the first sign of misunderstanding. It is the courage to allow some moments of discomfort, trusting that clarity does not always require immediate agreement. For INTJs, the challenge lies in balancing T's drive for efficiency with Phi's internal value system. Their statements, often distilled to strategic precision, can be mistaken for bluntness or cold detachment. By intentionally integrating Phi's nuance, INTJs can frame their systemic visions in ways that resonate not only intellectually, but emotionally, creating bridges where once there were only declarations. Carl Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." In communication, this translates to an awareness of the unseen, the assumptions, projections, and interpretive filters that color every exchange. Mastery lies in choosing when to illuminate these layers for others and when to let the silence speak. Have you ever noticed how certain conversations feel like a constant act of negotiation? Not about content, but about depth. How you gauge, moment to moment, whether the other person is willing to follow the thread or whether it is safer to let it go. Translation, then, becomes an act of emotional intelligence, but also of self-respect. It is the refusal to over-explain for the sake of convenience, while also refusing to hide behind complexity for the sake of ego. It is knowing that not every symbol will be understood, but choosing to offer the invitation anyway. This balancing act is not static. It shifts with context, with relationships, with the evolving awareness of both speaker and listener. The key is intentionality, to communicate not out of reflex, but out of conscious choice, to decide when depth is needed and when simplicity suffices, without feeling that either diminishes who you are. Have you ever simplified your thoughts only to feel a subtle grief at what was lost in translation? But have you also noticed moments where, by offering a carefully chosen doorway into your symbolic landscape, someone else found their way in? If this touched something buried, keep going. You're not alone in this. In the end, the journey is not about becoming universally understood. It is not about molding your language to fit every ear, nor is it about resigning to the solitude of never being heard. The path forward lies in embracing symbolic communication as an art, one that requires discernment, patience, and a quiet, steady reverence for your own way of perceiving. To speak in symbols is not a flaw to be corrected, but a mastery to be cultivated. It is a different mode of expression, one that transcends the transactional exchange of data. It invites connection, not through explanation, but through shared meaning-making. But mastery does not mean expecting the world to meet you halfway without guidance. It means knowing when to let a symbol stand as it is, and when to offer a bridge into its layers. INFJs and INTJs often carry a deep frustration, the belief that if others truly listened, truly cared, they would understand. But understanding is not a passive act. It is an active choice, a collaborative dance. Mastery lies not in demanding that others decipher your codes, but in inviting them into a space where the code itself becomes a shared creation. For INFJs, this mastery involves holding firm to their emotional depth without over-explaining or diluting it for fear of discomfort. It is about trusting that the right people will sense the resonance, even if it takes time. For INTJs, it means recognizing that their systemic insights, while often compressed into efficient declarations, can become even more powerful when framed in ways that invite emotional engagement, not just intellectual assent. Jung's words echo here. Your vision will become clear only when you can look into your own heart. Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes. Speaking in symbols is, at its core, an act of inner clarity. The more attuned you are to your own symbolic patterns, the more intentionally you can offer them to the world, not as cryptic fragments, but as invitations into a deeper conversation. Not every moment requires depth. Not every interaction is an opportunity for symbolic resonance. But you, as an INFJ or INTJ, hold the ability to choose. You can decide when to let words remain simple, when to offer a glimpse beneath the surface, and when to extend a hand into the vastness of your internal world, trusting that some will take it. Have you ever considered that your frustration in being misunderstood is not a sign of inadequacy, but a sign of discernment? That your mind operates on a channel that is rare, and that rarity is not a burden, but a filter, refining the connections you cultivate? Symbolic communication is not for everyone, but it doesn't need to be. Its power lies in its ability to transcend surface noise and forge connections that are few but profound. To embrace this is to move from frustration to intention, from disillusionment to quiet mastery. When you realize that speaking in symbols is not about being heard by everyone, but about being truly seen by a few, the burden lifts. You are not here to dilute your depth for mass consumption. You are here to craft bridges for those willing to walk them. If this helped you understand your own communication patterns or someone else's, share it with them. And if you want to explore more of these depths, consider subscribing. This journey is far from over. Perhaps the reason you have felt so persistently misunderstood is not because you lack clarity, nor because your thoughts are too complex, but because you have been speaking in a language that few are ever taught to hear. You have been offering symbols, gestures, patterns, and pauses, not as decorations, but as bridges. Bridges that, more often than not, stretch across to silence. But silence is not emptiness. It is space. Space that waits to be filled with those who recognize that conversation is more than words, that communication is a shared construction, not a unilateral transmission. You are not here to translate your symbols for everyone. You are here to offer them with intention to those who are willing to learn their shape. Symbols are not shortcuts. They are doorways. And while many will walk past them, never noticing, some, rare and few, will stop. They will step through. And when they do, the depth of connection you've always longed for will not feel like an anomaly, it will feel like coming home. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Perhaps in the end, communication is not about being understood by all, but about having the courage to remain who you are in a world that often asks for less. So, you will continue to speak in symbols, not because you have to, but because you choose to. Not because you are resigned to loneliness, but because you trust that those meant to understand will hear you, not through the noise of words, but through the resonance beneath them.